Russian special military operation in Ukraine, sort of a transition from the operations that were initiated in October by General Surovikin when he took over command of the special military operation to stabilize the situation and to prepare the Russian forces for the next phase. It looks like we're getting ready to enter to that next phase. We've seen a shakeup in the Russian command structure where General Valery Gerasimov, the chief of staff of the Russian armed forces, has taken over command of the special military operation, and we see that General Surovikin has been placed in a new position, which is to command the Air Force component of what the next phase is going to be. The implication of this is that we're looking at something that's going to be on a much broader scale, a larger scale, a grander scale than what has transpired prior to this. So a new phase of the conflict. We also had a interesting admission by the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, where he said that Ukraine is a proxy of NATO, that this conflict between Ukraine and Russia is really a conflict between NATO and Russia, and that Ukraine is willing to sacrifice its lives, the lives of its troops, but in order to do that, they need more equipment to be brought in. So today, I think we're going to focus on a couple things. First of all, the notion of a proxy conflict. Is this something new that just happened after the Russian military intervention in Ukraine back in February of last year? Or is this an extension of a mindset that's existed in NATO and the United States prior to this, where the West has been preparing for this very conflict? And then the other thing I'd like to focus on is the weaponry that's getting ready to pour into Ukraine from NATO, from the United States. This is a major escalation of the conflict. We're talking not just Patriot air defense systems, but Challenger 2 tanks from Great Britain, Leopard tanks from Germany, Bradley fighting vehicles from the United States, and other equipment. I couldn't think of anybody better to bring on to discuss this than my guest today, Stanislav, a United States Army officer, somebody who's experienced in everything that I've just discussed. And he's also experienced with Russia and the West. He has, my understanding of your bio is you served in Georgia as part of the observer mission there, and that you also participated in training operations within the NATO context, training Bosnian forces on how to use NATO equipment, NATO weaponry, and such. So I thank you very much for coming on. I understand that you were a commissioned officer in the United States Army, and yes. And yet you left the service. And I think it's important, before we move on to the specifics of the SMO, maybe for you to tell the audience why you left military service in the United States. So what were the reasons?
Well, I left the service in let's see, my as they say in Russian, Dembil, was 18 July 2004. So it was quite a shock when I finally had more years out than I had in. That year rolled around. I spent just a little less than 11 years in service. Was an enlisted soldier in the Guard when I was at NC State. Then got a active duty commission, reserve officer active duty. And then at the end, I was an instructor at the Green to Gold Academy at Fort Bragg for the National Guard. Last year and a half service. Was in Macedonia and Bosnia, was a military advisor in Georgia for the UN mission. But what, as these missions, I started getting sent out on these missions. I mean, I never fully assimilated, I guess, we can start with that, because I grew up in the South in Charlotte, where there were about 50 Russian speakers in the whole city. At that point, about 500,000. And well, the Cold War was at its peak in the 80s, so wound up in a lot of fights, being Russian, especially when Red Dawn came out. When that movie came out, God, it was a fight every other day. So that was interesting. And then I started running into things such as when I was in advance camp, I was wanting to go into military intelligence. And then I met the colonel who was in charge of accessions for lieutenants into military intelligence. Spoke with him. I don't have an accent. I might have picked up a little something over the last 12 years, but I don't have an accent. It's a particular Southern accent. I can switch that on. And I told him, yeah, sir, I'm interested in military intelligence. Oh, that's great. But I don't know if this is going to be a problem because I was born in the Soviet Union. I'm Russian. He looked me up and down like a piece of shit and told me to go screw myself and not bother to apply. Damn Russian. And he walks off. That was kind of the first serious hit. When I tried to go into special forces, I was told I was a captain by that point. So they didn't curse me out, but they told me quite firmly that, we don't know if we can get your top secret clearance. We're not going to bother trying. Thanks for applying. Go away. But what really hit was when I was in Dragon Brigade, which was the rear headquarters brigade for 18th Airborne Corps. And we were pulled in basically, and I was liaison officer for the G3 from the rear corps to the main staff. And we were doing various exercises, usually exercises by troops. So, computerized exercises with the staff. And constantly, these exercises were all fighting the Russian army. Yeah, they chose different terrain features. They never said the Russian army, but it's the Russian army structure. They used Russian generals, bios Russian generals. The exercises themselves were relatively ridiculous because you had 18th Airborne Corps, which is a light corps, fighting off and defeating a Russian tank army in an open area. So just the concept of that's already, but it got passed up the chain of command. That was a great success, and so on. But these constant exercises like that, and you start to look around. And it's like, yeah, well, the politicians are saying, we're friends. This is a great new era and all that. But the reality is we're still getting ready for war. We're not getting ready for war with China. We're not getting ready for war with whomever else. The only exception was the 6 months before Iraq. So we were planning out the invasion of Baghdad. Other than that, it stuck pretty much straight only for fighting the Russian army. And then in places like Yugoslavia, when I was there, I start speaking with the locals because Serbian is close enough to Russian. You can maybe not understand all the details, but you definitely get the gist. And a lot of people there speak Russian, and then the reality floods in. We see the jihadists; we're not allowed to touch them. Well, in fact, half the time we're supporting them. We see who what they're doing against the Serbs, but okay, so ignore it, drive by, things like that, and it just started to wake up. And when 99, when Clinton was bombing Yugoslavia, that really hit home because I had a lot of Serbian friends in the U.S. in my church, and I'd been there, just gotten back from there, and I've seen the reality of what's going on, and I've seen the Islamists building up. They're getting ready to walk all over us to get to the Serbs. They're bringing T-55s from Egypt, as an example, and all of that. So that pretty much did a good job opening my eyes on a lot of things.
It's interesting because when I was in the 80s, at the National Training Center, we had the OPFOR, which was organized to be 2 Soviet motorized rifle regiments. So we weren't making any bones about who we wanted to fight. We were fighting the Soviets. That was all we were trained to fight. But when but the difference was, for instance, if you go to the Berlin Brigade, they had a Detachment A, which was a top secret special forces detachment. And many of the people in that detachment were people born on the other side of the Warsaw Pact. In fact, they actually had a couple guys in the 70s who fought with Germany during World War II. Funny story about they were saying how they wanted anybody who had jumped into Normandy could go back for one of these anniversaries, or anybody fought in Normandy. And there were a couple older Special Forces sergeants who raised their hand. The guy turned to one and said, "You're a German. What do you say?" And he said, "Well, I was at Normandy, but I was on the receiving end." But he was in the U.S. Army with top secret clearances and one of the most secret special forces units around. And when I carried out weapons inspections in the Soviet Union, we had foreign area officers, Soviet foreign area officers. Half of them had Russian names. They spoke fluent Russian because they grew up speaking Russian. So I don't understand that when we were actually enemies with the Soviet Union, we were far more tolerant of people with a Slavic background and joining and participating. But then when we ostensibly became friends with them, suddenly the door seems to be shut. And I've always likened it to the fact that during the Cold War, we actually respected the Soviet Union. We feared the Soviet Union. Therefore, we had no problem about treating them as equals. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we move into the decade of the 90s with Boris Yeltsin, et cetera, we stopped respecting Russia. We stopped fearing Russia. And we started treating Russia as a second-class power. And when that happens and you lose that respect, it isn't just a political thing. It appears that it seeps down into the military itself, where one would think you would be a perfect candidate for special forces, native speaker, loyal American. We could use that, but they rejected you. And it appears that, and this is where I'm going to get onto the present situation. It appears the United States, in the post-Cold War environment, has always been preparing to fight Russia. That there was never a period of time where we said, no, we can be friends with Russia, we can peacefully coexist with Russia. We've always viewed Russia as the enemy. Is this an accurate appraisal, or what's your assessment?
From the elites, yeah, I think that is an excellent appraisal. The people, I think that everybody took a deep breath. The Cold War's over, so we can go on with our lives and forget about it. But I don't think amidst the elites, I don't think that ever went away. I think what happened was in the 90s, especially under Yeltsin, everybody was looking at it, well, Russia's going to self-destruct. So we can ignore it, maybe push it a little here, help the Chechen jihad. They were flooding in Islamic fighters from all over the world. So they can help there, they can push here, destabilize a little. But for the most part, the Russians are drinking themselves into the grave and they're going to self-destruct. And then when everything got switched over to the Middle East with Iraq, all the attention went there. And Russia got back on its feet. I think that's when they realized, okay, the pressure needs to go back on. And I'd probably say, I won't even say 2008 was a key role, because in 2008, Russia beat Georgia barely, because a third echelon army that moved, which wasn't, I don't think that was an expectation to even move. It moved, but it fought badly. Equipment was old, tactics weren't the best. And I think that just confirmed at that point for the West that, now they've got the motivation to move, but they're still inadequate and there's nothing to fear. And I think 2013 in the Crimea, that was a bit of a wake-up call. And the main wake-up call was in Syria. And Russia has got the motivation and is now reorganized and can actually carry on activities. So I think by that point, in my personal view, is when the pressure really started catching on. That push Ukraine into war. Brzezinski, he had that the Eurasian chessboard. He always said that if Russia ever unifies with Ukraine, or even comes into a close alliance with Ukraine, we won't be able to stop them. So we've got to make sure they're enemies, always enemies.
It's interesting you brought up 2008. I view that as a critical year for a couple of reasons. One, I'm glad you brought up the Russian invasion of or the war with Georgia. I mean, we can have a discussion about who started it, whether it was Saakashvili, moving in, or it was provoked by the South. The bottom line, though, is we know who finished it. It was Russia.
Right.
But my understanding is that the Russians, it's not just NATO looking at Russia. It was Russia looking at itself, saying, we didn't do very well. I think Russia was very impressed with Georgian light infantry tactics. The Georgian infantry had been trained by the Marines and by some soldiers from the United States, and they were tactically proficient, and in many cases tactically superior to the Russians. Their communications was better. They just lacked the heavy weaponry, and Russia was able to steamroll through them. But the Russian tactics would not have worked against a premier NATO force. Russia would have been defeated piecemeal had they done that. And I think the Russians recognized that, and that's when they began the process of reorganizing and modernizing their military to get better equipment, better training, more emphasis on contract soldiers, things like. And then in 2014, when they went into when the little green men made a move on Crimea, people sort of woke up and said, that's a new Russian army. And then they went into Syria and they realized this is qualitatively better than anything we've ever seen from Russia. But then we have parallel thing. That's sort of the Russian response. But even before, because the Russian-Ukrainian conflict was in August, or the Russian-Georgian conflict was in August. In April, William Burns, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, wrote a memorandum called "Niet means Niet," no means no, about the Russia's red lines about Ukraine. And he pretty much said that if NATO invites Ukraine in, it'll set in motion a string of events that will inevitably lead to a Russian military intervention in Ukraine that will cost Ukraine Donbass and Crimea. So, and yet in November, after the Russian-Georgian war, we invited Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. And it just tells me that from the very beginning, from 2008, we were embarked on a course that we knew would lead to some sort of military confrontation. Now, we decided to organize the military confrontation as a proxy war using Ukraine, and we've been using Ukraine ever since 2014. With coup in the Maidan, and then using Minsk as a sham diplomatic shield to train up a Ukrainian army capable of carrying out offensive operations. But the Western perspective of that this was an unprovoked war of aggression on the part of Russia isn't matched by reality. Now, my understanding is you live in Russia today.
Yes. Yeah, I moved back almost 13 years ago.
Right. So what, just on the ground, I mean, you're familiar with, what I just said about the American perspective or the Western perspective about this war. Are the Russian people cognizant of the realities, or have they been ignorant about the threat posed by the United States, by Ukraine, et cetera? Do they understand what's going on in Ukraine today, or are they still confused?
The vast majority of the people understand now. When I moved back, I told people, and I told people that I should have listened, several people, that this was coming. It's what I knew, that the drive is going to be only one direction. And nobody wanted to listen to that. You were upset, that you got insulted or slighted. Like, no, I didn't get insulted or slighted. I'm telling you the reality. And people didn't want to hear that. I mean, it's just, and people who should have heard it didn't want to hear it either. When I talk to people, I won't name any names, but it was easier to live in the La La Land. La La Land got narrower and narrower, especially after 2013. After the Valdai speeches started getting narrower, and then after that, it was the Munich speech, Putin's Vladimir Vladimirov's speech, and then after that, after 2013, I remember 2013 was happening because I'm from Lugansk. That's my hometown. And I'd been in Lugansk in 2013. I was getting ready to go back because I had to bury my great aunt, grandmother, second removed. She had no relatives left in Lugansk. So I was planning on going there to bury her. And all of this started exploding. And I was director of supply chain for Halliburton for Eurasia. And I remember that point, I was driving with a couple of my guys to go check out a warehouse in the south of Moscow. And one of these guys was a former major in the Russian army. And he asked me, Stas, what do you think is going to happen? Sasha, it's going to be a major bloody civil war. Like, how can you say that? How can I say that? Because I know who's behind this, and I know what the drive on this is. Like, no, we can't believe it. It can't be that bad. Well, that was 2013, and we saw what happened over the next 8 years. So I wish I had been wrong. I very much so wish I had been wrong. But history played out. History played out.
So now here we are in this proxy war between NATO and Russia, with Ukraine as the vehicle for this war to take place. The United States and NATO have made some decisions now to provide heavy weaponry to Ukraine. Challenger 2 tanks, Leopard 2 tanks, Marder fighting vehicles, Bradley fighting vehicles, etc. If somebody's familiar with this equipment, I guess two questions. One, what is the ability of Ukraine to absorb this equipment in a meaningful fashion, to turn it into a viable weapon on the battlefield? And two, if they're able to do that, does this equipment represent a game-changing technological advance for Ukraine? Will this help turn the tide in favor of Ukraine against the Russian forces? Just from your opinion, as somebody who is familiar with this technology.
Well, Major, as they say, an army lives on its belly. So logistics wins wars, logistics loses wars, and I cannot imagine a worse logistic situation than in Ukraine. One, there's no experienced people to service the equipment. There's now dozens of lines of equipment that requires thousands of parts. There's no backup of parts. If you're gonna repair equipment, and you got to shove it back over to Poland, so you got to move it back another 500 kilometers out by roads that are getting hit, by rail that's getting knocked out. Get it across the border, get it fixed, bring it back in. Okay, so all right. So if you've got a tank brigade, you've got 2, 3, maybe you got 7 spare engines. If you're an Abrams tank, okay, that doesn't last very long. Level 3 service on an engine, if it blows out, that's taking it all apart. Can't be done in Ukraine. So you got to shove that on a train or in a truck and drive it back out to Poland. I mean, that's a disaster. And for any army to have to deal with that, I think half the logistics people probably already, if they haven't hung themselves, they'll shoot themselves before this is over. I can't even imagine the pressure on them. And then, military logistics tends to be very, very well organized. It has to be. It has no other way. And I can't imagine the nightmare for this. I'm glad they're having a nightmare. Don't get me wrong. Because my friends are on the front. I've been down to the front line. Going back again. We're bringing help down there, equipment and various materials. And I know what they're going through. So yeah, I'm glad Ukraine's having this nightmare. I'm not going to be. I am biased. I'm going to say I'm not biased, and I do have a dog in this fight. But as for any army to have this many different types of equipment, a hodgepodge, I don't think this is going to transform much of anything. First of all, there's not that much of equipment coming in, at least right now. Yeah, sure, you can make an armored fist for a brigade-sized element, maybe. One brigade at this point in this war isn't going to change anything. The special operation is swollen to over 400,000 soldiers on one side. I guess you could say close to about 500, 600,000 on the other side, though most of these guys aren't really soldiers. Pulling a guy off of the street who was a tractor driver or a farmer and giving him a rifle, 2 weeks of training, throwing him out there. It's just creating meat. I mean, it's cannon fodder. But the fact is, sure, you can make a limited armored fist. And then again, if they're incompatible tanks, if you're throwing in different equipment, servicing them, this is a one-time ride. So when they get attrited, there is no effective way of replacing them unless the Germans or the Poles or the rest of NATO is just constantly going to be pushing more and more tanks in. But for the most part, I mean, this is a one-time shot. They're done. They're hit. They're damaged. They're not going to get pulled off the battlefield and sent back in any kind of volume back up to Poland. Not in my opinion, anyways. I don't think that's going to happen. And if they're on the defensive, then there's absolutely no chance of that equipment ever getting reinstated.
Now, when you were in the Army, did you ever go to the NTC? Did you ever do a rotation through NTC or the equivalent?
Well, equivalent in Hohenfels.
Okay, yeah, okay. The reason why I asked the question is, I would imagine Army training, like Marine Corps training, tries to be as realistic as possible in terms of intensity, operational tempo, etc. How often did things break?
Well, let's begin with this. When I got to Germany, my first shock was my first tank platoon, a brand new second lieutenant out of Armor School of Fort Knox. I get to Germany. My first tank platoon, out of 4 tanks, I had 1 reliable tank, 2 questionable tanks, and 1 tank that was always broken. And the reason for that was we didn't have spare parts. I mean, as stupid as that sounds. And I explain that to people because they think, oh, America's got this huge budget, the Army's full of everything is like, no. By the time the contractors and everybody up top takes their share and their rollback and kickback and whatever, but what gets down to the line units is squat. My pads on my tanks, our entire company had no pads. So our cooling tubes on our tracks were getting crushed. So the bolts were overheating and the tracks were coming apart. So we finally get these pads in, just as a great example for the audience. We finally get these pads in, and they come in on Friday at 5 p.m. The XO of the company decides he wants to go drinking. So the hell about grabbing a couple enlisted and moving all these pads under lock in the garage, the company garage. He just leaves them out there. Next morning, Monday morning, Alpha Company has nothing. Beta Company has all brand new pads. my NCOs were great scroungers. When you start explaining scrounging, like, oh yeah, we're just stealing from each other to make ends meet, and it's ridiculous. So yeah, when it comes to an Abrams tank, the average is, or the rule of thumb is, for every hour of use, 2 to 3 hours of maintenance. That's a
Now,
rule of
if you're a
thumb.
Ukrainian soldier, let me put it this way: were the people who maintained your tanks? I mean, were they just guys that you recruited from auto mechanic school, guys who could repair, or did they have to get trained on doing this? Were they, I mean, was this a secondary skill, or did you have dedicated maintenance people?
No, first of all, we had dedicated maintenance people, absolutely. MOSs were strictly maintenance people. These guys didn't have any secondary MOSs as far as I knew. So from day one, from after basic, they went to advanced advanced individual training, and that was all maintenance. So these guys are experts. Now, I mean, if it's a Leopard 2 or one of these other tanks that's a diesel engine, at least there's a crossover. If you can fix a diesel engine in a truck, you can fix a diesel engine in a tank, because the concept's all the same. Now you throw in Abrams, that's a jet turbine engine. That's a whole different animal. That's a whole different level. I mean, you need aircraft mechanics for that, flat out.
Yep.
Never mind, you also need jet fuel to run it. Diesel doesn't work. So I mean, which is, by the way, just another insane level of logistics when you have to have a separate fuel train, a giant separate fuel train. The Abrams tank, to turn over the turbine once, for it to turn over, so you switch the tank on, the first rotation drinks 6 gallons or 24 liters of jet fuel. It goes down. It goes down after that, yeah. But it's 6 gallons for the first rotation. So you keep switching it on, switching it off. You're going to go through fuel like crazy. But tanks go through fuel like crazy, because when you're fighting, you're not going in a straight line. You're going forward, back, left, right, forward, back, left, right. You're really not going that far forward, but you're doing a lot of maneuvering and a lot of idling.
But now, when you trained in Hohenfels, the training area, would your tanks go on well broken in trails and across known terrain features and such, or were you just freewheeling going across country? And what I'm trying to get at is, I think there's a difference between training, even realistic training, and combat operations, and the wear and tear it puts on vehicles. That in combat operations, there are no rules. You're running over anything and everything in order to stay alive. You're putting more stress on sprockets, on bolts, on suspension, on transmissions, on everything. That cause things to break down. So even in a normal 1 operational hour, 3 maintenance hours, that probably even comes close to doubling in combat conditions.
Oh yeah, I mean, okay. Well, being Germany, you still had restrictions because they have insane laws as far as protecting nature. So yeah, depending what area you're in, you can what lanes you're running. Certain lanes you're pretty much bound to the terrain feature that the lane dictates. In other areas where it's freewheeling, yeah, you go anywhere you want. But yeah, the terrain. I had one tank, and we're getting ready to finish, but there's this huge puddle, as ahead of us. Oh, huge, like a small pond almost. And my driver's like, "Sir, I don't want to wash the tank. Can I go around it?" I'm like, "Okay, try go around it." And he goes off, and there's a little bit of embankment, so the tank goes off like this and stops. And I hear this, and I'm waist up in the hatch, and I hear this ping, and I look over, and trees are just falling. Boom, 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 boom. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Like, holy crap, what just happened? And I saw something flying, and I couldn't tell what the hell it was. a loud metal ping, and the tank's not moving anymore. At least the right track isn't moving anymore. So look down. What happened was, because the tank's at an angle, it sat most of its way down on the back right sprocket. The back right sprocket sheared. So the part that was inside the drive sheared off of the actual star, and that flew out like a frisbee, a steel frisbee flying at an insane speed, just mowing trees down. Thank God we got out of there fast enough. They didn't notice, so they didn't find me for every tree that fell down. I think I'd have got bankrupt on the spot. The Germans were charging some insane couple thousand Deutschmarks per tree at that point. But yeah, I mean, that's just regular wear and tear. We weren't doing, I mean, we were doing intensive enough work, but again, this isn't strict battlefield. So the tanks were being fixed between lanes, the tanks were being maintained, and yeah, and things break all the time, constantly break. I mean, it's the name of the game. It's a tank.
Now, as a tanker, what would you assess your survivability if your platoon was fighting by itself on the modern battlefield, in isolation, just a platoon?
Just a platoon of tanks.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to use curse words, but less than zero. In reality speaking, if you're fighting, especially if you're fighting against combined arms enemy, an enemy can get in behind you, pop you with an RPG in the tail. Yeah, your chances are zero. I mean, reality. If so, you're not killed outright, you need to be fighting as part of
you have to be fighting as part of a combined arms team.
Absolutely. I mean, to take out a tank, realistically speaking, you need one guy with an RPG to take out a sprocket. That's a mobility kill. You don't even have to kill the engine. You can just kill the mobility kill, take out a sprocket. And what does a tank become after that? It becomes a TRP. It's just waiting for its artillery round to end its life. And it'll come soon enough. So, yeah, zero survivability chance.
Now, how easy was it to train with infantry? Could you just be introduced to any random infantry unit and you suddenly become an effective combat team, or did you have to train with them over a period of time to develop combined arms tactics?
It's a good story, if I may. We were at Fort Bragg training. We had a combined arms going against airborne troops. So we're going across this drop zone. We had a platoon of tanks. We should have had two